Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the Other Israel Film Festival. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being a part of these conversations. And of course, all the conversations are recorded and are presented on our YouTube channel, the Other Israel YouTube channel, where you can reference all the conversations that are taking place from this past week and going on, of course, till Thursday. For the rest of the day, we have more events coming up. At 4 p.m. we have here the conversation for Kings of Capitol Hill, and we'll be here with some of the participants and the director of that film. And then at 6 p.m. we have an event actually in Hebrew for Israelis, for a different perspective on some of the short films that we've been presenting here. Tomorrow, another full day of events, and as I mentioned, we are here till Thursday. I'm really excited to introduce now the panel for The Prophet and Golda. This is a combination of two films that I think, obviously, I hope everybody recognizes we're making no comparison between Meir Kahana and Golda Meir, but rather the connection being the deconstruction of history and two historic characters. It's really one of the areas that Other Israel has been expanding into in the last few years, and I think took a leap forward this year as far as bringing in new perspectives to Israeli history that are impacting the politics today. And that's, I think, the most important part is really how these two historical figures have impacted the world that we are in today. I want to give a huge thank you also to our partners, and that includes, you saw all of our partners on screen, and of course the New Israel Fund as a lead partner. But for this screening, we wanted to highlight Hadassah and Trua. Please check out all of our partners on the partner page and check out the New Israel Fund's field guide to really see the work that's being done on the ground and which organizations you could support once you're inspired by these films. So we have an amazing panel put together here for you today, and I'm excited to introduce them and then hand things over to the moderator and not have to handle it myself. But if you have any questions, please do put your questions in the chat box, and then when there's time, if there's time, we'll open it to questions from the audience and open your mic to ask it in person. So from The Prophet, we have the director here, Ilan Rubin Fields. Hi, Ilan.
Hi. Hello.
Thank you for joining us. And he'll be joined also by Shaul Magid, who is a professor of Jewish studies and is actually in the process of writing a book about Meir Kahana. Shaul, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And then on the other side of the court, just kidding, this is not also, they're also not against each other. That's not how we set this up. We have the film Golda, and we have the director here, Udi Nir.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you, Udi, for an amazing film. And he's also going to, his tag team is going to be Francine Klagsbrun, who is the writer of, the author of Lioness, Golda Meir and the Nation of Israel. Thank you, Francine, for being here as well.
It's my pleasure.
And to moderate this conversation, we have here the Upper West Side Shaliach, Harel Fenigstein himself. Harel, I hand it over to you.
Shalom, toda rabba, Isaac. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today and participating in this. And I'm very excited about this panel and about this hour we're going to spend together, specifically because these two films, two documentaries are tremendously interesting, and I never thought, and I love watching documentaries and films. Came out from watching both films so invested, like I felt so invested in them, being Israeli myself and growing up with these two, I want to say, personas. So it was interesting and it was amazing to watch it. And I want to say personally, I came out from watching both these movies with totally different view on each one of these people. Like, on my views on Golda, that I came to the movie, to watch the film with, and the image that I had of Kahana that I came to watch the film. So thank you very much for the creators, the directors, and I'm sure the specialists, the panelists on the, as Isaac called them, the teams, would help us, solve more of the mystery or shed more light on those people. So thank you very much for joining us. And specifically, thank you also, Ilan and Udi, for joining us at this late time of the day in Israel. Toda raba. I don't have a lot of time, so let me start. And I said in a conversation between us that I wish we had more time to discuss because I have so many questions, and I'm sure that people are interested in hearing your views and your takes. So I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna ask some questions. Some of the questions gonna be similar to both, to all of you, but feel free again to participate and answer, even if I didn't point a finger at you and ask that question specifically to you. So it's gonna be an open discussion. I actually want to start with you, Udi. If you can tell us a little bit about how the documentary became to happen. It's a very interesting story.
Yeah, it was quite unusual actually for us because we did not initiate it. About almost 4 years now. Almost 4 years ago, we got a call from our partners in Germany and who knew us from a previous project, and they commissioned us to make a film, a biographic film about Golda Meir. And our initial response was, why now after so many years? Why us? We were 3 directors in this project. All 3 of us were born way after Golda's time in power and after she passed away, actually, and we didn't live through the time. And above everything, I think we just didn't realize what's the interest they have all of a sudden in Germany, of all places, in Golda. But pretty early on in working on this film, we realized that there is such a huge gap between how Golda is perceived in Israel and how she's perceived anywhere else in the world. As we found out in Germany as well, but I think more than anywhere, probably in the United States and with American Jewry specifically. And when she's known around the world, and again, specifically more than anywhere in the United States, as a feminist icon and as one of the most familiar faces of Zionism, and as a very positive character in general, some named her the Queen of the Jewish people and so on. In Israel, we knew a totally different story. And the image of Golda that we had was of this old, rigid, inflexible, old-fashioned failure, basically. She is a synonym for failure in Israel, I would say. And she was disgraced for many, many years. And we found that gap to be fascinating, a fascinating starting point to make a film. Because we figured that there must be things that people around the world are missing about Golda's stories because they didn't experience what Israelis experienced under her rule. And there must be things that Israelis are missing about Golda's character if she's so revered elsewhere in the world. So that's really what I think set us off to this project. It didn't come from us, but it very early on was fascinating for us to dive into.
So, before I continue to Francine, just literally a sentence about finding those documentary materials. I think it's an amazing. It's like a vault of amazing. For a documentary people, it's probably amazing.
Yeah, we had a very big documentary miracle in the process of working on this film, because when we started it, we had nothing unique. We had the worn out footage of Golda that many Israelis know from some very famous TV broadcasts before and after the war and during her time in office. And we were actually very close, and we had talking heads, people who were near her or around her and could give us testimonies. But about 2 years into working on the film, when we already had pretty much a complete film, it was due to go on air roughly 2 months after that point. We were missing a couple of shots of Golda, pretty technical stuff, Golda getting into a car or walking into the Knesset building, stuff like that. And we did one last trip to the Israeli TV archives in Jerusalem, which is anything that you can expect from an Israeli archive. It's messy, it's uncatalogued, nothing is in order, but it's also full of surprises, and there's always interesting stuff to be found. And when we went there, again, just on this last moment for some few technical shots that we were looking for, somebody there told us, look guys, we know we were making a film about Golda. We just found an old carton box on the floor here that we're just moving to a new building. It says Golda on it, but the tapes inside are uncatalogued and they're very, very old. We don't even have the machinery to read them anymore. So they offered us, if we want to take them on our own expense, convert them and check maybe the shot that we're looking for, Golda getting into a car, might be found there. We took the tape, we took the gamble. We're very happy for that today. And when it came back a few weeks later as a file, we opened the file. The first thing we saw was Golda lighting up a cigarette, which in itself is not a unique thing. She used to smoke heavily and all the time and everywhere. But even back then, it wasn't considered okay for an Israeli prime minister to be smoking on television. She was once quoted saying, if the youngsters want to have cancer, they should do it on their expense, not on my expense. So we realized that we're watching something unique. And then a few minutes later, what we found out is that these are basically almost 30 minutes, 27 minutes of an informal conversation between Golda and two journalists from the Israeli television. And it's basically her last documented interview, her last television interview. This footage never aired. It was an off-the-record conversation just after the show that they recorded in the Israeli television studios shortly before her passing. So it never aired, mainly, by the way, because she smoked. That was the main reason that the Israeli television didn't want to air it at the time. But they kept it somewhere in a box. Nobody saw it for 40 years. And then we came along and were lucky enough to come across it. And again, we were just about to finish the film, but that was a big game changer. And we basically spent the year after that.
It gave you like the stamina and the core of the movie, which like.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an intimate kind of moment that is hard to find with Golda in interviews. And she also related to all of the major issues of her primary. So it was a fascinating material for us to base the film on. So we re-edited the film for an entire year after that.
So we right at the verge of Hanukkah. So that was your Ness Hanukkah, the miracle of Hanukkah for you and for your movie. Thank you for that. I just want to say, I love the fact that you kept in the movie when she offers a cigarette to one of the newspapers and he says he can't smoke those heavy cigarettes that you smoke. So that was an amazing thing, and also depicts some of Golda's character. So Francine, I want to turn to you because I think you went through a similar process, taking a substantial amount of years of your life exploring Golda, and also with the same, I think, goal of shedding a new light on Golda, right?
That is absolutely correct. He said exactly what my purpose also, except it took me about 8 years, almost 10 years until I wrote this book, to do all the research and the writing. And I went to not only archives, but also television archives. I didn't see this, although it looked very familiar to me, but I guess if he discovered it, I didn't see it. But yes, and I was curious about almost the same thing, the difference of feeling about her here. I grew up in America where we loved Golda, but I have many Israeli friends who did not love Golda. And I did want to find out, I also wanted to just find out who was this woman. I mean, she was, after all, the only so far female prime minister of Israel. And we finally will have a female vice president, but we've never had a female president in the United States. So I really wanted to know who she was and how she got to where she went. And so that was the essence of my research in many, many archives in Israel. And then none of them are in great shape. They're not so easy to work at, but one can find their one's way, and that's what I did. And then and I did it. I was asked to write this book by an editor by Shachen Books, and then spent all those years researching. I had an Israeli researcher who helped me, Boaz Lev-Tov, who could be in Israel when I couldn't spend my days there, all my days there, and interviewed more than 100 people, many of whom are no longer alive, including members of her family. I got to know her son and daughter very, very well, her grandchildren, and on the documentary, one of her grandchildren, Gidi, is on that documentary, and most of the people are in the documentary as well. And then I felt that I did know her, and I could write about her.
Thank you for that. Before I move and ask Ilan and Shaul two similar questions, I just want to say, I didn't say it at the beginning, but thank you, Isaac, and the Center for Israel, like the Israel Center Film, sorry, for putting these two documentaries together. It's there's so many parallel things on these two documentaries, and it's a very well done for putting these two documentaries together. Even it doesn't give us a lot of time to ask everyone's enough questions, but so it's very, very similar. And I would love to ask the same thing for you, Ilan. What brought you to create this film?
Thank you. Hi. So I'd say the beginning of the film was a convergence of a few different forces in my life. Back in 2015-16, it wasn't so obvious why a film about Meir Kahana should be done, let alone a film by someone who was 4 years old when Kahana was assassinated. That's not a spoiler, I hope, for anyone. So back in 2015-16, there was another round of violence between the Israelis and the Palestinians, what was known as the Third Intifada, or the stabbings Intifada. And a childhood friend of mine, who I didn't consider to be interested in politics at all, shared a video of Kahana on Facebook after a terror attack in Jerusalem. And I love politics, I really do. And I grew up in Jerusalem, where Kahana to this day is still like a living ghost, I'd say. But when he shared that video and I clicked to listen to what he was sharing, I realized that I had never actually heard Kahana speak. He was, in Israel, he's this like, he's a slogan, but no one, they know his face, his image, and his name, and there's this slogan, Kahana Tzadak, Kahana was right, but no one really knows what he was right about. So I listened to that 5 minutes of him speaking, and I literally fell down the rabbit hole. I spent probably 5 or 6 hours that night of watching Kahana clips on YouTube, and I immediately realized that this is something I want to look into, because he was talking 30 years ago about the way I felt things were happening in Israel today. And then I went to my parents and I told them, hey, Meir Kahana, I've been watching videos of him speak. And they told me, sure, Kahana, we met Kahana a few times in Skokie in the mid-70s. There was a famous, I don't know what to call it, story about Kahana, the JDL, and the neo-Nazis in Skokie. I'll need 2 hours to explain that whole story, but the bottom line of it was that the JDL got involved in the fight against the neo-Nazi march in Skokie. And from my parents' point of view, the threat of violence given by the JDL caused the authorities to cancel or to move away the neo-Nazi march from Skokie, which back then was very much Jewish. And so from their point of view, the threat of violence, the Kahanist threat of violence, was justified. It worked. He was the good guy in that story. So I realized at that moment that this was something I needed to look into a lot more, because this was just, he was more than just, Israel's demon, which I think is what the majority of Israel sees him or used to see him, maybe not today anymore.
Yeah. Well, the jury is still out on that, I think, in Israel. So before I ask you, Shaul, something, I just want to, something that is fascinating me has been, like, I was fascinated by watching the movie and, you know, thinking about it. Why the prophet? Like, he refers to prophets in the movie, in the film, sorry. But why do you choose the title, The Prophet? And do you look at it as a positive or a negative title?
Yeah. Well, the first and easiest answer would be to just annoy some people. No, to get people going, you know, not be comfortable from the get-go in a film. So also he referred to himself in certain portions of his life in sort of biblical terms. Maybe Shaul can say a bit more about that. But mostly I think, yeah, he spoke about things that people didn't really understand were the key issues in the existence of Israel and maybe the Jewish Judaism in the 21st century, back in the 70s and the 80s. I think the clash between democracy and Judaism, he understood, and Zionism, he understood that was something that was going to be the main route that Israeli history was going to travel through in the decades to come. I don't, you know, you don't have to agree with his opinion, with how he thought you should solve these issues, but you definitely can acknowledge that he saw it a lot before others did.
Interesting. Thank you. So Shaul, I'll ask the question for you from your research and from your knowledge about Meir Kahana. Was he, I don't know how to say it in English, and I'm sorry, Nevi Zam, a prophet of rage? Was he, am I saying the term correctly? Sorry.
Yeah, that would be correct. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Robert Friedman, who was a journalist for the New York Times, wrote a book in the 80s on Kahana called False Prophet. So in a way, he kind of plays off the same kind of thing, except obviously the Navi Sheker, the false prophet versus the prophet. I think I just wanted to just make one point that was alluded to. I think, although we're not here to compare Golda Meir and Meir Kahana, even though they both share a name in being Meir, strangely enough. But I think there's an interesting comparison in that they're both American Jews who immigrate to Israel and remain very much in an American mindset in the way they think about things and in the way they understand both Israel and their own sense of identity. So Golda's coming from a kind of secular labor, a community in America, and Meir Kahana is coming from an orthodox, more right-wing reactionary. But I think one of the interesting comparisons in the films is their American-ness, both Golda's and Kahana's American-ness. They never strip themselves of that, and in part, I think the failure of both of them, because I think they're both successes and failures simultaneously, is that in some way, and this is certainly true with Kahana, Francine could say whether it's true with Golda, that part of the failure of Kahana is that he was never able to strip himself of his American mindset. He saw Israel in the terms of the race wars and the culture wars of the late 1960s. And he tried to transpose that onto an Israeli society. And it never really worked. What ended up happening, and you see this from the people that were in the film, which I really liked, by the way, Ilan, thanks a lot, it was really great, is I think the Kahanism that exists now is really a kind of neo-Kahanism. In other words, Kahana is over. And in a certain sense, he is an iconic figure, but he's an iconic figure in that he introduced the relationship between Jew and Arab the way he saw the relationship between Jew and Black in the 60s. And in a certain way, he failed because Israel is a very different environment and the Arab population is a very different environment. So I think that's an important thing. I just want to bring up one thing that Ilan said, which I think is also important. and this comes through in the film completely, Kahana saw that there is a crack in the spine of Zionism on the question of Israel being a Jewish and democratic state. He knew that there was a problem with that. He was one of the first on the right to say that that was simply an impossibility. Now, it's interesting because there were many people on the left that were saying that that was an impossibility. But he was the first person on the right that said you can have a Jewish state, you can have a democratic state, and you can have both. Now, people have been arguing about that for the last 50 years. But I think that the question of democracy, liberal democracy, ethnic democracy, which is a term that didn't exist in his time. And for Kahana, there's one kind of democracy. That's liberal democracy. Everybody has equal rights, and that equal rights are protected by the law. That he claimed was an impossibility in Israel. And I think more and more, I think a lot of people in Israel are coming to recognize that that may be actually true.
You know, I want to respond if I can to the part. I don't think Golda was stuck in Americanism at all. I think what she was stuck in was her labor point of view, the socialist labor point of view of Paulette Zion, and then Mapai, and then the Labor Party. That was where she was. She could not understand people, and I was in the film also, wanting money. Her mind was always set on the poorest people. It was always said, why was so needed? When I came, I didn't even have a refrigerator. I didn't care. I mean, that was her point of view. It was not really, and if anything, it went back to Kiev and fear of pogroms of Eastern Europe. That's where she came from. Not so much from America, although she loved America and she used her American contacts brilliantly. I also want to say one other thing, that I came to the conclusion that Israel was really, in a way, unfair to her. That the negative view, there's a lot of reasons for it, and some of it is legitimate, but some of it is not legitimate, and some of it has to do with her being a woman, and some of it has to do with it not really understanding what happened in the Yom Kippur War. And that was some of the things I was trying to set straight. I don't know if I did, but I think there's been a change in Israel itself, more of an acceptance of Golda, not because of me, but in general.
So I'm taking from what you said, Francine. Thank you very much, Shaul, for bringing this and actually bringing more points that I want to bring that we were about to talk about. I want to take on that. I think both figures are very, and the movies, thank you, Udi and Ilan, brings this complexity in their, in their way and who they are. With Golda, being a feminist, that she didn't want to,
she was not a feminist. She was anti-feminist.
Yeah, but she didn't look at, but in our mind, she was the first prime minister, and everyone looks at her as a feminist, and she didn't look at herself like that. And with Kahana, I think he looked at himself as the Navi, or as the prophet, or as a bringing, saying enough is enough. Jewish democratic state can't exist. And I think both of them in that concept, we're bringing the movies bringing this complexity. So I want to focus a little bit on the movies again, back on the movies, and ask Udi and Ilan, and we'll start with you, Ilan, now. Udi, I hope that's okay.
Absolutely.
What, at the end of the day, what did you want to gain, or what you wanted to gain from putting this movie out there? What was the purpose, or what do you think, you wanted people to see?
I think probably one of the main things was that we need to listen to people that everything they have to say, we resent everything they have to say. For years, I think in the Israeli political discourse, and probably in the American one in recent years too, I mean, people are just in these echo chambers, and I really wanted to set out to make this film and not preach to the choir. It would have been very easy to make this film to what you would call a captive audience, the immediate audience of documentary films in Israel, which is sadly mostly left wing, and tap myself and my friends on the back and say, we're not Kahanists, and that's good. And that would be the end of it. But so I really wanted to have these people. My pitch to the Kahanists when I would meet them, and they would immediately recognize that I'm not on the same political side as them, was that I'm fine with letting them express their opinions candidly. I'll give them the screen time, and I won't mix anything that they have to say, because I want to listen. So that usually worked. Yeah, so that would be it, I think.
And I can say that it's there in the movie, being, you know, Israeli, watching Baruch Marzel and Benzi Gopshin talking on a documentary is, here you go, you get a stage. So it's an amazing. Udi, because you spoke about it a little bit, I just want to change the question and ask, do you think you've achieved bringing a different light to Golda, you know, the one that we perceive as, you know, as Israelis, as Americans? Do you think you achieved that through the movie?
It's always hard to say once the film is out, and it's hard to know what it really did. But I can say that one of the major things for us was to create this kind of more layered or complex view of Golda, and also I think to evoke some empathy, which I think in Israel, at least, I think that we were lacking some empathy for this woman. With all of the criticism that I also have of her, but working on this film really brought up that kind of empathy in me towards her and in us, and I think we wanted to convey that forward. But the interesting thing, I think, for us when the film came out was to see that when it came out in Israel, the first reaction to it from critics, from be it positive or negative, but from critics and the audience, everybody agreed that the film was forgiving towards Golda, that it showed a more positive side of her than we're used to seeing. And then when we went to the United States last summer to first screen the film there in San Francisco, at the end of the first screening, someone stood up and said, "Thank you for a wonderful film, but I have to understand, what is your beef with Golda? Why does the film attack her so much?" So, and I think at that moment we realized that we probably, this is what we set out to do. We wanted to be able to challenge both flat views of this woman to something a little bit more layered. I can say that one of the greatest achievements of this film for me, and again, it's hard to measure. I don't claim that we've changed Golda's story or that we set out to change her story, but in our little, scope of what we can, how we can reach people and so on, the most moving thing for me was when Reuven Abargel from the Israeli Black Panthers, who's in the film, came up to us after the screening and also wrote an article for Haaretz later. And bear in mind, this is a man who had to sit in prison for a long while, and suffered grave personal consequences to his life as a direct result from his interaction with Golda and the power that she held over him. And he came up to us at the end of the screening and said he still doesn't agree with her. He still thinks that she did big mistakes in how she handled him and his friends and a bunch of other issues, but he feels that he has a different context to that encounter now after watching the film, and that he is able to sort of let go of a lot of years of resentment towards her and feel some compassion for her. I think that says a lot about him as a person and what he is able to do and how he is able to forgive, and more than it says about the film. But I do think it was a very moving moment for us to see that the film could do this, at least for him.
Thank you. I'll add to that. I think it's echoed, what you're saying is echoed also a little bit with Uri Avneri at the end of the movie, when he's like more reconciled with her and saying, she wasn't the best choice, but, all
but
things
she was
considered,
a great woman. He said, but she was a great lady, he said.
Yeah, exactly. At the end of the day, when we're looking at
Uri
nowadays.
Avneri to say that is incredible.
Yeah, one of the things
reconciliation.
When we went into the interviews, one of the things that we set out to do was we chose people according to whether they were for her or against her, and try to balance it as much as we can to have both sides of the argument. And one of the things that we set out to do is with the ones that were against her, one of our goals was to get them to say something good about her, just as a method along the interview of trying to break down, the norm, all the stories that we already know that they have about her, and vice versa with the ones that loved her, with her family members, with her grandson. We tried to get them to say some words of criticism about her, to say something a little bit more layered than just she was amazing, she was the queen. And with Udi Nir, he's now passed away, of course, but with Udi Nir, it took us, I think, almost 4 hours. He was the hardest nut to crack, and a fascinating man, of course, but eventually he said, it's right at the end of his interview,
Right. So it's a very strong image there in the movie. Shaul, I want to go back to you and ask a question, and then Francine, I'll ask you a very similar question. So heads up.
Okay, ready?
The whole, and Ilan, thank you very much for bringing it. The presence of New York and American Jewry is so present in the movie, and we see at the beginning the JDL and New York touching more of Soviet Union Jews and the whole a little bit of anti-Semitism, but a lot of focus on the Soviet Union Jews. And then he ends up, and that's where he got married, and also coming back to New York, talking about Arab and Jews, like Arab and Jews. So what do you think was, how do you see this parallel, and how do you see his journey with New York on that topic?
It's a great question. I mean, in my book, I basically make the argument that Kahana's career in America, as short as it was, I mean, he founds the JDL in 1968. He immigrates to Israel in September of 71. It was a very, very short and potent thing. He doesn't get involved into the Soviet Jewry movement until December 1969, when the Soviet Jewry movement was almost a decade old. I think one of the things that I thought is that, in a sense, I see Kahana's Israeli career as a kind of coda to his American career. His American career was a critique of liberalism. It was a critique of American Jewish establishment. It was a critique of the acculturation of American Jewry in the 1960s. It was about Jewish pride. It was really a diasporic program. In his first book, Never Again, he only has one chapter on Zionism. It's not really a focus of his until he ends up moving to Israel. So I think that, and I'll say, by the way, even after he moved to Israel in 71, until his assassination, he spent about half the time in the United States, including spending a year in prison, that he had to return from Israel to America to spend a year in prison because he broke certain probation laws from something he was convicted of earlier. So I think that my one critique of the film is that it doesn't show, it does show a little bit, but not enough, the way in which America and New York, urban America in particular, never really became separated from Israel for him. In other words, it was always trying. He continued to write books in English to American Jews until 1987. He writes a book, Uncomfortable Question for Comfortable Jews, in 1987. He had already been living in Israel for decades. So I think that Kahana as a figure, is much more, in some way, more interesting as an American reactionary militant critic of Jewish liberalism than what happens when he goes to Israel and gets involved in the political parties and has this kind of vision of becoming the prime minister of Israel with the intent to basically overthrow the state. I mean, he really does come at the end to become a kind of anti-Zionist. I mean, he's the one that he responds to Abba Eben's claim of Kahana being a racist by saying, it's only secular Zionists that are racist. I'm not a racist. I believe that God gave the land to the Jews. If you don't believe that God gave the land to the Jews, then what right do you have to be here? So he ingeniously is able to kind of turn these categories in interesting ways that I think are continue to show his kind of American-ness. And to a point, there's this one interesting vignette when he's arguing with Charlie Bitton in the Knesset, when they're yelling at each other from across the room. And Charlie Bitton, of course, was part of the Israeli Black Panthers also. So Kahana thought that the Israeli Black Panthers were going to be on his side because they were the Mizrahi Jews that were at war with the Ashkenazi elite. But it turns out that they turned out to be his enemies because many of the Israeli Black Panthers were also siding with Israeli Arabs. So it became this kind of very fascinating and interesting triangle between the Mizrahi Jews, the Israeli Arabs, and Kahana's very American mindset of kind of the race wars.
Thank you. I totally agree with you. And I think that's another parallel and another example of how these two movies are connected. Ilan and Udi didn't know that, but thanks to the JCC here, like we know how these two movies are totally connected. So Francine, similar question, and that will be our last question before we go to the Q&A. Because it's very strong, her opinion, and it's very maybe similar to what Shaul was saying about Kahana. Golda's view on American culture, you know, she speaks about money as a value, how it became a value all of a sudden. And also the narrator, one of the narrating places in the movie, it says, Americans saw her as one of theirs, one of them, and Israelis saw Golda as, you know, a great representative of our ambitions in the American ministry. So what do you see as Golda's connection with specifically America, but also with New York and her journey from here to back to Israel?
New York, her connection with New York was really that simply she loved it. I mean, that was not New York was not the essence of her. Her connection with the United States was much more complex because, as I said, I mean, she then, you know, saw herself as an Israeli. It's American Jews, and particularly American women, adored her because we saw her as one of us. You know, she's one of us. She's an American kid, and she made good, an American girl who made good, number one. Number two, she did what the rest of us in America, Zionists, we call ourselves Zionists, but we didn't do. She made Aliyah and devoted her life to the state of Israel. That's something we didn't do. So we both, I'm not her generation, but I came soon enough after I know enough about it. Saw her as part of America in that sense, but went way beyond America. As far as she was concerned, she had in a sense of mixed feelings about America. She was here almost every year. I used to laugh. There was almost every year after she left, she came back. There was a reason to come back. She was raising money. She was dealing with the pioneer women. She was always here for some reason. And she loved being here. And she loved staying up late at night and talking to people and having ice cream in coffee shops on the one hand. On the other hand, she didn't like American culture. She was particularly when it got to the flower children, when it got to that part of the 60s, she felt that the Israeli kids were imitating Americans in a very negative way when she spoke about the miniskirts in the film. She thought that was terrible. They got that from the United States. They got these bad values. And she described it. I have it in my book, that she had been there and she saw these things happening. And she was very distressed. She doesn't want Israeli kids to copy what's going on in America. So she's very negative about America in that sense. So I think it was mixed. It was a love-hate relationship, one could say. She had great respect for the country, but she left the country. And I will say this, the other founders of the state all came from countries where Jews were being persecuted, right? They came from Eastern Europe. Now, she was born in Eastern Europe. She was born in Ukraine, but she left the United States. She left the country where Jews were well treated, where Jews had equality, where, this was a great country for Jews. She gave that up to go to Palestine. So she loved America, but she had a much broader ideal in her mind, and that was going to Palestine and the state of Israel.
Thank you very much. Isaac, we're moving to questions from the audience.
I'd love to take some questions from the audience. Thank you folks for posting them in the chat, and we're gonna call on Carol Kornreich for the first question. Carol, you're on the air.
Hi, I actually am Carol's husband, and we've been watching this together, and it's a fascinating discussion. the question I had about the Kahana movie, which I really enjoyed very much, is this, that frequently the problem between countries is not described, but the leaders hijack it for their own political needs on both sides. And so you never really get what is the problem. The problem is the violence that is killing Jews, the Arab terrorists. And I sort of felt like Kahane particularly was very good at hijacking for his own purposes. He was a zealot. I respect that, but I don't agree with it. And I thought that the film didn't really discuss the larger context of leadership. And that wasn't your purpose, but I felt that was a feeling that I had as I watched it.
The leadership on the Jewish side, on the Israeli side?
The leadership clearly struggled in a very useful way, but I guess I was looking at it from my American eyes in the current context and the settler movement and the right, et cetera, et cetera.
I'll say a few words. First of all, the vast majority of the political system in Israel treated him as a clown. There wasn't any, and tried to censor him. So there wasn't like any in-depth look by anyone on any side of the political spectrum towards Kahana. Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Can I add, Ilan, and maybe we'll put you back. I think, and we see it in the movie, the unprecedented decisions within Israeli Knesset and also within Israeli society brought to what that looks. So,
okay, I mean, it is important to say that Kahana was in Israeli parliament for 4 years, and Israel is not very forgiving towards its political figures. Golda is a good example of that, and we should ask why, 40 years after his death and 40-something years after he was in parliament, he's still talked about. He's still discussed. I think in many ways he was just a trailblazer of issues, of conflicts that Israel doesn't really want to solve. Interestingly enough, a lot of the trials that he had while he was in parliament today are being used by Arab Knesset members when they're when the Israeli establishment is trying to rule them out, trying to prevent them from running. So the whole discourse on it is based on what Kahana had back in the 80s when they tried and succeeded in banning him from politics. So it's interesting to see how things sort of flipped on that way. And also I will add that the politicians who were considered right-wing and fought him as right-wing politicians back then, Dan Meridor is sort of their representative today, is not considered right-wing at all. I mean, he's centrist, maybe leftist, depending on who you ask. So that sort of shows you how the whole system has shifted to the right, and maybe how his answers, Kahana's answers to Israel's problems are still, echoing in Israel, and why he's still being talked about. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. We have a question from Susan Halper in the chat. Susan, do you want to try to take this, or should I read it out? I'll read it out. I thought in connection with the Yom Kippur War, Golda wanted to have preparations for the war, but was persuaded to listen to people like Moshe Dayan, who did not believe the Egyptians were ready for war. This seemed to overlook this and caused her to feel responsible for Israel's loss and the loss of life on both sides. Why do you think this happened?
Do you want me to take it?
Go ahead.
Okay, we'll both take it.
Yeah, if you want, I can start.
Do you want?
Udi, start.
Udi, go ahead.
I can say that when we were looking into the Yom Kippur War, and especially the months and the weeks and days leading up to the war, we were trying to sort of crack that tough nut and understand what really happened there. There are accounts from Golda, from other people. You can read, what happened on paper, but we were trying to realize what was the crucial moment and why did things play out the way they did. And the defining moment for me, I think, was imagining for the first time the situation that Golda was in. She is at that point a 70-plus-year-old woman with quite a lot of illnesses and not in the best physical shape. After a month of leading up to sort of this kind of build-up for war that happened in Israel from May 1973. So it started a few months before. And there was this constant question of war or no war, And then at the crucial moment, she walks into her cabinet, basically, or it's different forums, but eventually she always walks into a room full with some of the most revered generals, not just in Israel, but around the world. The generals of the 67 war, who were, world famous for their glorious military victories, yada, yada, yada. And into that context, she comes in, and I try to imagine myself or anybody I know walk into that room and listen to the consultation of all these generals and be, as strong as your intuition will be, or your conviction that war will break out, which was Golda's conviction all along, it would have been impossible for almost anyone to stand up to all these men and say, no, you are all wrong, I'm right, a war is coming. So I definitely believe that at that crucial moment, Golda is not to blame. And I think that for many years, she was wrongly sort of blamed for her part in the war in that moment. I do think that Golda has a big part in what led up to the war, but I'm talking about the years that led up to the war, not the strategic or tactical decisions in the weeks and days before the war started, which is the only thing that she was criticized for in Israel for many, many years.
Yeah, I will second that. I don't think it had anything to do with age, frankly. I think it had to do with the fact that a young man without the experience of Moshe Dayan and those famous generals would probably have given in the same way, because there was this concept, they called it the conception, which was that Egypt will not go to war unless it gets certain weapons from the Soviet Union, and Syria will not go to war without Egypt. And it was very, very strong. And that conception, that was number one. So they were so sure there would be no war, but they were also so, the term that actually Tzvi Zamir, whom you interview on the film, used is hubris. There was such hubris after the 67 war. The concept was, so what? And even if they go to war, look what we did in 67, we'll beat them in no time. So Golda, I mean, who could stand, as you say, who could stand up to that? She was the only, and somebody just did an article called the civilian who predicted war. And she was the only one who had that sense that war was going to come. I just want to say something, because Udi will not agree with me on this. The years leading up to the war, there have been a lot of research since the war on secret meetings that she had, on attempts that she did to make peace, to try to make peace. She was rigid on her side, but so were they rigid on the other side. Sadat's position, because he didn't want to get assassinated, was Israel had to give up everything, not just Sinai. She was ready to give up Sinai. Israel had to give up everything and then go back to the pre-67 borders, and then they would talk about peace. Well, there was really nobody except maybe some fringe people who were willing to do that at that time in Israel's history. We look back now and say, oh yeah, they should have done it. But at that time, put your head back there again, it would seem like a stupid thing. You won the war in 67. Why would you give it all back? And Sadat was just as rigid about that as she was about not giving it back.
Yeah, it will be a long discussion if we start discussing that.
I know.
No, I think you'll be surprised. I agree for the most part. I think very few people in Israel at the time, especially public figures, would have agreed to anything like that. But I don't think that anything short of that would have done the job. And so I think it was still a mistake, even though it was made by a lot of people.
But you know what? Sadat in the end accepted just Sinai when he felt stronger. Of course, he got assassinated anyway, but when he felt stronger. But at that time, he would not give in on accepting just Sinai, which would have been an easier thing. They could have made a deal on that.
Before we continue, I'll just put an end to this part of the discussion by saying that I think the movie explored both options or both, state of mind, and you come out of the movie thinking about actually exactly this point.
Yes, so I think it's very fair. I think the movie's very fair.
Yeah.
And I think in general, both films actually have this kind of objective perspective of bringing both, maybe just bringing multi perspectives of bringing in different sides that keeps some sort of a balance and allows an amazing conversation like this one to happen. There's a lot more to say. There are a lot more comments and questions. And in a few minutes, we're going to jump into breakout sessions for those who want to continue the conversation and have it in a more personal, open manner. But before that, we have one last comment or question from Carol Zabar, the founder of our festival. Carol, you're on.
Hi. The years that I lived in Israel from 61 to 65, she was Secretary of State, and I wouldn't say she was a figure of fun, but nobody really accepted her as a real Israeli for a lot of reasons. She acted like she had come from one of the Scouts movements, and everything should be socialist like it was, they taught in the Scouts. And her accent was something that really hampered her, because she sounded like she walked off the boat. She spoke good Hebrew, but she sounded like an American. And I think that was a much earlier part, but at that time, she wasn't really revered at all. This is between 61 and 65. And then, of course, later on, it was a different denouement. Do you agree, Francine? Do you think that was really part of it?
Well, she wasn't, when she was out of office, it's like out of mind, out of heart, out of sight, out of mind. When she was out of office, her ratings were very, very low. It's when she got back into office that her ratings went, before the Yom Kippur War, that her ratings went way up. So it was in the years when she, I would say, when she was foreign minister, from 56 to 66, I think she was well respected, but she was traveling a lot. She was her big thing was making friends with Africa was a very big thing, and making friends with America. She was really big on that. Eisenhower didn't love America. She had really pushed for friendship with Kennedy and so on. So, but she did have, and I have to say, she did have an American accent with her Hebrew. And that I love, because when my Hebrew has such an American accent, I always could relate to Golda with her American accent. So there was that. But I think you're right. She wasn't as revered as she was when she became prime minister.
Before we break into, thank you, Francine. Before we break into breakout sessions, I want to give another big thank you, first of all, to our partners. I'm going to start with NIF and then mention also, once again, Hadassah and Trua. I'm going to give Hadassah the Golda side and Trua the Meir Kahana side, only because they're of their rabbinical and territories elements too. But I want to give a big thank you, first of all, to our moderator, Harel. Thank you for doing this. To all of our panelists, to Francine, Udi, Ilan, and Shaul, thank you so much.